The grand arrival. The soft hum of tires on asphalt broke the serene stillness of the early evening as the Johnson family's modest sedan pulled into the circular driveway of the illustrious Orion Grand Hotel. The towering glass structure shimmered against the golden hues of the setting sun, its facade a dazzling combination of steel and light. For most, the hotel stood as a symbol of luxury and exclusivity. For the Johnsons, it represented the culmination of a dream years in the making. James Johnson, a man in his late 30s with a composed demeanor and an unwavering determination etched into his features, stepped out of the car. He adjusted the strap of his worn leather messenger bag as he glanced back at his wife, Vivian, and their 11-year-old daughter, Emily. Vivian, an elegant yet unpretentious woman with an air of quiet strength, was helping Emily out of the back seat. The young girl, clutching a stuffed giraffe close to her chest, looked up at the towering building with wide, nervous eyes. "Are you sure this is the right place, Dad?" Emily asked, her voice a soft whisper. James chuckled, ruffling her curly hair. "Positive. Sweetheart, this is where we're meant to be." Vivian placed a reassuring hand on her husband's arm. "It's going to be fine, James. We've worked too hard for this." Nodding, James led his family toward the gleaming entrance. As they approached, the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing the grandeur within. The lobby was a spectacle of opulence. Gleaming marble floors stretched endlessly, chandeliers sparkled overhead like constellations, and impeccably dressed guests mingled in small groups or lounged in plush chairs. Yet, as the Johnsons stepped inside, their modest appearance seemed to draw a quiet but palpable shift in the atmosphere. James adjusted his bag nervously, his eyes scanning the room. "Let's get checked in," he said, his voice steady but with an undertone of apprehension. They approached the check-in desk, where a young receptionist greeted them with a practiced smile. Before James could speak, a man in a tailored navy blue suit emerged from an adjoining office. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, and his cold, assessing gaze landed on the family. The name tag on his lapel read, "Mr. Franklin, General Manager." "Good evening," Mr. Franklin said, his tone professional yet tinged with an unmistakable note of skepticism. "May I help you?" "Yes," James began, his voice polite but firm. "We have a reservation under James Johnson." Mr. Franklin's gaze flicked over James, then lingered on Vivian and Emily. His lips tightened into a thin line. "Are you certain you're in the right place? This is the Orion Grand Hotel." Vivian bristled, her smile remaining composed but her tone firm. "We're quite certain. Please check the reservation." Mr. Franklin's expression remained unreadable as he turned to the receptionist, who hesitated before typing into her computer. "I'll need a moment to confirm," she said nervously, avoiding the Johnsons' gaze. James pulled out his phone, holding up the confirmation email. "Here's the email," he said, offering it to Mr. Franklin. The general manager didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, he folded his arms and replied with a dismissive tone, "That won't be necessary." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "Why not?" "Because," Mr. Franklin said, his smile cold, "we reserve the right to decline service when necessary. I believe this is one of those situations." Emily clutched her mother's hand tightly, her wide eyes filling with tears. "Mom, why is he talking like that?" she whispered. Vivian crouched down to Emily's level, her voice calm despite the fire burning in her eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. Some people just don't know how to treat others properly." James stepped forward, his posture straight and his tone unwavering. "Mr. Franklin, I'm asking you one last time to check the reservation. We're paying customers, and we have every right to be here." "Sir," Franklin said, his voice rising slightly, "I don't need to check anything. We reserve the right to refuse service at our discretion." The quiet tension in the lobby began to draw the attention of nearby guests. Whispered conversations rippled through the air as eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. James clenched his fists at his sides, his patience wearing thin. "This is unacceptable," Vivian said, her voice sharp but composed. "We will not tolerate being treated this way." Franklin's smirk widened. "You can take your indignation elsewhere. Perhaps a roadside motel is more appropriate for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with insult. James felt a mix of anger and humiliation welling up inside him. For a moment, he considered raising his voice, but a small squeeze from Vivian's hand stopped him. "We'll leave," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. He turned to Emily and whispered, "Let's go, sweetheart." As the family walked toward the exit, Emily tugged on her father's sleeve. "Why are they being mean to us, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. James knelt down, looking into her tear-filled eyes. "Sometimes people judge others without knowing their story. But remember, it's not about how they treat us. It's about how we rise above it." Vivian placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm. "And we will rise above it." As they stepped into the chilly evening air, James cast one last glance at the hotel's glowing facade. His jaw tightened, and a steely resolve settled in his eyes. This wasn't over. The quiet resolve. The Johnson family drove away from the Orion Grand Hotel in silence, the tension in the air as thick as the night settling around them. Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her stuffed giraffe clutched tightly in her arms. James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, while Vivian glanced at him occasionally, her worry evident. "James," Vivian finally said, breaking the silence, "we can't let this go." "I know," James replied, his voice low but filled with purpose. "But this isn't the time to make a scene. I need to think." "Think?" Vivian's voice was sharp, her anger barely contained. "That man humiliated us in front of everyone. Treated us like we didn't belong. He didn't even give us the courtesy of checking the reservation." James exhaled, his grip on the wheel loosening slightly. "I know, Viv, but charging back in there without a plan won't fix anything. I want to make sure when we go back, it's on our terms." Emily's small voice piped up from the back seat. "Are we going to stay in a different hotel, Dad?" Vivian turned to face her daughter, her expression softening. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. Don't worry." James glanced at the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the sight of his daughter's tear-streaked face. "We'll make this right, Emily. I promise." The next morning, the dawn brought a renewed sense of determination. James was already awake, seated at the small desk in their temporary accommodation, a modest but clean motel a few miles away. Papers and a laptop were spread before him, the screen glowing with spreadsheets and emails. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness matching the resolve in his heart. Vivian walked in, her hair still damp from a shower, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've been up for hours," she said softly. "What's the plan?" James leaned back, rubbing his temples. "I've been going through the hotel's financials, policies, staff reports, everything. I want to understand exactly what we're walking into." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "You mean, besides an arrogant manager with a superiority complex?" James smirked faintly. "Yes, I need to know how deep this problem runs. If Franklin's attitude reflects the culture of the entire hotel, we've got a bigger issue." Vivian pulled up a chair beside him. "So what do we do?" "We're going back today," James said firmly. "But this time, we're not just guests trying to check in. I'm going in as the owner." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "And you think Franklin is just going to roll over and apologize?" "No," James replied, his voice steady. "But he won't have a choice when I show him the truth." The return to the Orion Grand. Later that morning, the Johnson family drove back to the Orion Grand Hotel, this time with an air of quiet confidence. Emily clutched her giraffe, her earlier nervousness replaced with curiosity as she watched her parents' determined expressions. As they entered the lobby, the atmosphere was just as grand and bustling as the night before. Mr. Franklin stood near the front desk, speaking with a few staff members. When his eyes landed on the Johnson family, his expression darkened. "You again?" Franklin said, stepping toward them. I thought I made it clear. James held up a hand, silencing him. You've said enough. Now it's my turn. Franklin frowned, his lips tightening. I'm not sure what you think you're trying to do, but... You don't need to be sure, James interrupted, his voice firm but calm. You just need to listen. The boldness in James's tone drew the attention of nearby guests and staff, the hum of conversation in the lobby quieting as people turned to watch the confrontation. Listen to what? Franklin sneered. Your complaints about last night. You can take them up with guest services. Oh, wait, you're not even staying here. James didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. This is the acquisition agreement for the Orion Grand Hotel. I signed it 2 weeks ago. Franklin's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his face. What are you talking about? Vivian stepped forward, her voice sharp. What he's saying is that you're looking at your new boss. James Johnson owns this hotel. The crowd in the lobby gasped audibly, whispers spreading like wildfire. Franklin's confident demeanor crumbled as he stared at the folder James handed him. He flipped through the pages, his hands trembling slightly. This must be some kind of joke, Franklin stammered. Nobody informed me. Because I wanted to see how things operated without interference, James cut in. I wanted to understand the culture, the staff, the leadership, and last night I sought everything I needed to know. Franklin's face turned red. Sir, I didn't know. If I'd been aware. That's the problem, James said, his voice rising slightly. You shouldn't have to know someone's status to treat them with basic respect. What you did last night wasn't just unprofessional, it was discriminatory. Vivian nodded in agreement. You judged us the moment we walked in. You didn't check the reservation. You didn't listen. You decided we didn't belong here based on nothing but your own biases. Franklin opened his mouth to respond, but James held up a hand. Enough. I've heard all I need to hear. A staff meeting. By mid-morning, James had called an emergency staff meeting in the hotel's grand conference room. The room buzzed with tension as employees, from housekeeping to concierge staff, gathered. Franklin sat near the front, his face pale and his posture rigid. James stood at the head of the room, his gaze sweeping over the staff. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. For those who don't know me, my name is James Johnson, and as of 2 weeks ago, I am the owner of the Orion Grand Hotel. Murmurs rippled through the room, and James raised a hand to quiet them. Last night, my family and I were treated in a way that was not only unacceptable but emblematic of a deeper problem. I want to make something very clear. This hotel will not tolerate discrimination, arrogance, or disrespect toward guests or staff. He glanced at Franklin, whose face was now flushed with embarrassment. Effective immediately, Mr. Franklin is relieved of his duties as general manager. Gasps echoed through the room, but James continued without hesitation. I've reviewed reports from employees and guests, and it's clear that the toxic culture stops today. We are going to rebuild this hotel, not just as a symbol of luxury, but as a place where every person feels valued. A young woman from housekeeping hesitantly raised her hand. Does that mean things will change for us too? James smiled warmly. Yes, it means better treatment, more support, and opportunities for growth. But it also means accountability. We're all in this together. As the meeting ended, James looked out at the staff, seeing hope and determination in their faces. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. For the first time in a long time, the Orion Grand Hotel felt like it was on the verge of becoming something truly grand. The Johnson family returned home that evening, exhausted but fulfilled. Emily hugged her stuffed giraffe tightly, a wide grin on her face. Dad, she said, you really made them listen. James smiled, pulling her into a hug. And we'll keep making them listen, sweetheart. One step at a time. Transforming the culture. The following morning, Sunlight poured into the spacious office on the top floor of the Orion Grand Hotel. James Johnson sat at the sleek mahogany desk, his laptop open in front of him and a steaming cup of coffee beside it. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling city below, but his focus was solely on the task ahead, reshaping the hotel's culture. Vivian entered, holding a stack of files. "I've been going through the employee reports you asked for," she said, placing the papers on his desk. "It's worse than we thought. Franklin's behavior wasn't isolated. It's been trickling down to the entire staff." James sighed, rubbing his temples. It's not just about firing one bad manager, then. It's about rebuilding trust and setting a standard for how this hotel treats people. Vivian sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "We have to start from the ground up. Policies, training, leadership, everything needs an overhaul." James nodded. "We'll begin with the staff. They're the heart of this place. If we can earn their trust and empower them, the rest will follow." A new beginning. By mid-morning, James had called a meeting with the department heads, which included the head of housekeeping, front desk operations, food and beverage, and maintenance. A sense of uncertainty filled the air as the small group gathered in the elegant boardroom, exchanging nervous glances. James stood at the front of the room, his demeanor calm but firm. "Thank you all for coming," he began, looking each person in the eye. "I know the last 24 hours have been a whirlwind. Let me start by saying this. I'm not here to tear this place apart. I'm here to build something better." The head of housekeeping, a middle-aged woman named Carla, raised her hand. "Mr. Johnson, with all due respect, the staff is worried. After what happened with Mr. Franklin, people are afraid there's going to be a big shakeup." "There is," James replied honestly, "but not in the way you think. My goal isn't to punish anyone. It's to create an environment where everyone feels respected, supported, and valued." He glanced at John, the young bellhop who had spoken up the night before. John had been promoted to acting front desk manager, and he looked both nervous and proud. "Take John, for example," James continued. "He showed courage by speaking up, even when it wasn't easy. That's the kind of leadership I want to encourage." John's cheeks turned red as a few people clapped hesitantly. James continued, his voice growing more passionate. "But leadership isn't just about speaking up. It's about listening, about understanding the people you serve, whether they're guests or employees. From now on, this hotel will prioritize empathy, accountability, and excellence." Facing resistance. Despite James's optimistic vision, resistance soon became evident. Not everyone was on board with the changes. Some senior staff members, loyal to Franklin's old ways, grumbled about the new direction. One of the most vocal dissenters was Nathan, the head of food and beverage. A tall, imposing man with a brusque manner. He confronted James in the hallway a few days later. "Mr. Johnson," Nathan began, his tone sharp, "I've been with this hotel for over a decade. I know how things work around here. You can't just waltz in and expect everything to change overnight." James stopped, meeting Nathan's intense gaze. "I don't expect overnight change," he said evenly. "But I do expect commitment to doing better." Nathan crossed his arms. "And what if some of us don't think your way is better?" James's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath his words. "Then this may no longer be the right place for you. This hotel is moving forward, with or without you." Nathan's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further, stalking off down the hall. Vivian, who had witnessed the exchange from a distance, approached James. "That could have gone better," she remarked. "Maybe," James admitted, "but I can't let resistance derail the vision. Change is hard, Viv. Not everyone will be ready for it." Connecting with the staff. Determined to gain the staff's trust, James made it a point to spend time in each department over the next few weeks. He shadowed the housekeeping team, helping them clean rooms and listening to their concerns. He stood behind the front desk, observing how the staff interacted with guests and stepping in to assist when needed. He even joined the maintenance crew for a day, learning about the challenges they faced in keeping the hotel running smoothly. During these interactions, James noticed patterns. Housekeeping staff were often overworked and underappreciated. Front desk employees were stressed by the pressure to uphold the hotel's image, often without adequate training. Maintenance workers operated with outdated equipment, making their jobs unnecessarily difficult. One afternoon, while helping Carla clean a suite, James asked, "What would make your job easier?" Carla hesitated, then said, honestly, "Better communication. We're always the last to know about changes or issues, and it makes our jobs harder." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's something we can fix." Empowering the team. At the next all-staff meeting, James unveiled a series of initiatives aimed at improving working conditions and fostering a sense of community. First, he announced, "We're implementing regular staff meetings where your voices will be heard. This hotel can't succeed without you, and it's time you had a seat at the table." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Second, he continued, "We're updating equipment and resources across all departments. No one should have to work twice as hard because they don't have the right tools." More applause followed. And finally, James said, his voice strong, "We're launching a training program to ensure every employee has the skills and confidence to excel in their role. Leadership isn't just for managers, it's for everyone." As he spoke, James noticed a shift in the room. Faces that had been skeptical or guarded were now lighting up with hope and determination. A small victory. One evening, a week after the meeting, James and Vivian were walking through the lobby when they overheard a guest speaking with John at the front desk. "I just wanted to say," the guest said, "this is my third time staying here, and I can already see the difference. The staff seems happier, more attentive. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." John beamed, thanking the guest before turning to James and Vivian. "That felt good," he admitted, his smile wide. "It should," James said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're part of the reason this place is changing." As they walked away, Vivian glanced at her husband. "You're making a difference, James. People are noticing." He smiled, a mix of pride and humility in his expression. "It's just the beginning," he said. "But we're on the right track." The transformation of the Orion Grand Hotel wasn't happening overnight, but it was happening. Slowly but surely, the culture of arrogance and exclusivity was being replaced with one of respect, empathy, and excellence. For James, Vivian, and the rest of the team, the journey was far from over. But the foundation had been laid, and the future looked brighter than ever. The struggle for unity. The changes James Johnson envisioned for the Orion Grand Hotel were beginning to take shape, but the road was far from smooth. For every success, there were setbacks. For every employee inspired by the new vision, there were others who resisted, clinging to old ways out of fear or stubbornness. James sat in his office one afternoon, poring over reports. Vivian entered, carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. "You've been at this all day," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "Take a break." James leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. "It's harder than I thought it would be, Viv. For every step forward, it feels like we take 2 steps back." Vivian took a seat across from him. "That's the nature of change. People are afraid of what they don't understand. But you're doing the right thing, James. Don't lose sight of that." He nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Thanks. I needed to hear that." Just then, John knocked on the door. "Mr. Johnson," he said, stepping inside. "There's an issue in the lobby." James raised an eyebrow. "What kind of issue?" John hesitated. "A guest is causing a scene. It's about one of the staff." James stood immediately, his jaw tightening. "Let's go." The confrontation. In the lobby, a well-dressed man in his 50s was speaking loudly, his voice carrying across the space. A young woman from housekeeping stood nearby, looking distraught and clutching a cleaning cart. Guests and staff watched uncomfortably from a distance. "This is unacceptable," the man shouted. "Do you have any idea who I am? I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of incompetence. James approached, his expression calm but authoritative. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the commotion. "I'm James Johnson, the owner of this hotel. What seems to be the problem?" The man turned, his face flushed with anger. "The problem is your staff. I asked this girl to clean my room immediately, and she told me I'd have to wait." James glanced at the young woman, who looked on the verge of tears. "Is that true?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, sir. I was finishing another room when he stopped me in the hallway. I told him I'd get to his room as soon as I was done." James turned back to the man. "It sounds like she was doing her job." The guest's eyes narrowed. "Her job is to serve the guests. I'm paying a lot of money to stay here, and I expect better treatment." James's tone remained calm, but his words were firm. "Sir, we value all our guests, but we also value our employees. Yelling at her won't solve anything." The man's face turned red. "Are you seriously taking her side over mine?" "I'm not taking sides," James replied. "I'm addressing the situation fairly. If you have a concern, it can be handled professionally. But I won't tolerate disrespect toward my staff." The man muttered something under his breath, grabbed his coat, and stormed off toward the elevators. James turned to the young woman, who was still visibly shaken. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maria," she replied quietly. "Maria," James said, "you handled that situation well. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, but I want you to know we've got your back." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, sir." The ripple effect. News of the confrontation spread quickly among the staff. By the end of the day, several employees approached James to express their gratitude. "It means a lot to us, seeing you stand up for Maria like that," Carla said during a staff meeting. "A lot of us have been treated poorly by guests, but we've never felt supported until now." James nodded. Respect goes both ways. Guests deserve excellent service, but that doesn't give them the right to mistreat the people providing it. The meeting ended on a high note, but James knew the challenges weren't over. For every victory, there were still obstacles to overcome. The audit. A week later, James received a visit from the corporate auditors. Although he owned the hotel outright, the Orion Grand was part of a larger chain, and the parent company wanted to ensure the transition was going smoothly. The lead auditor, a stern woman named Ms. Parker, spent 3 days reviewing financials, policies, and guest feedback. On the final day, she sat down with James in his office. "I've gone through everything," she began, her tone neutral. "There's no question that you're making positive changes. However," James leaned forward. "However, your occupancy rates are down since you took over," Ms. Parker said. "Some of your high-profile guests have expressed dissatisfaction with the new policies." James frowned. "Dissatisfaction with what exactly?" Ms. Parker adjusted her glasses. "Your focus on inclusivity and employee welfare is admirable, but some guests feel the changes detract from the exclusivity of the hotel." James's jaw tightened. "So, because we're treating everyone with respect, a few entitled guests are upset." Ms. Parker raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to look at it." James took a deep breath, calming himself. "I'm not changing course. If those guests want exclusivity at the expense of basic decency, they can go elsewhere." Ms. Parker regarded him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You're passionate, Mr. Johnson. I'll note that in my report. Just be aware that passion doesn't always translate to profitability." Winning the staff's loyalty. That evening, James gathered the entire staff in the ballroom for an all-hands meeting. He stood on the stage, looking out at the faces of housekeepers, front desk agents, maintenance workers, and managers. "I called this meeting to say thank you," he began. "Thank you for your hard work, your patience, and your willingness to embrace change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know this hasn't been easy. Change never is. But I want you to know something. This hotel isn't just mine. It's ours. Every one of you is part of what makes this place special." Applause rippled through the room. "I also want to address something I heard recently," James continued. "Some people think focusing on inclusivity and respect makes this hotel less exclusive. To that I say, good. We're not here to cater to arrogance or entitlement. We're here to create an experience that's exceptional for everyone." The applause grew louder, and James felt a surge of pride. For the first time, he could see the staff beginning to truly believe in his vision, a new guest experience. The next day, James introduced a new program aimed at enhancing the guest experience while reinforcing the hotel's values. The initiative included personalized service, cultural training for the staff, and even a gratitude wall in the lobby where guests and employees could share positive messages. Vivian, who helped design the program, beamed with pride as the first notes appeared on the wall. "This is just the beginning," James said, reading one of the notes aloud. "Thank you to Maria for going above and beyond to make our stay wonderful." The tipping point. As weeks turned into months, the changes began to take root. Guest satisfaction scores improved, staff turnover decreased, and occupancy rates started to climb again. More importantly, the Orion Grand Hotel was earning a new reputation, not just as a luxurious destination, but as a place where everyone was treated with dignity. One evening, as James walked through the bustling lobby, he saw Maria helping a guest with a genuine smile. Nearby, John was training a new front desk employee, his confidence growing with each passing day. Carla waved at James from across the room, her pride in her team evident. Vivian joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Look at what you've built," she said softly. James smiled, his heart full. "It's not just me, Viv. It's all of us." The Orion Grand was no longer just a hotel, it was a community. And for James Johnson, that was the greatest success of all. A test of principles. With the culture shift at the Orion Grand Hotel well underway, James Johnson began to feel a sense of pride and satisfaction. Staff morale had improved, the guests who stayed shared glowing reviews, and even the skeptics within the team had started to come around. Yet James knew challenges would arise. Change was rarely a straight path forward, and one such challenge arrived in the form of an influential guest. Mr. Preston Hall. Preston Hall was a billionaire investor known for his no-nonsense approach to business. He had booked the hotel's most extravagant suite for an extended stay while negotiating a major real estate deal. His reputation preceded him. He was a demanding guest who expected nothing less than perfection. James received word of Preston's arrival on a Thursday afternoon. Vivian joined him in his office as he reviewed the details. "This could be big," Vivian remarked. "If he has a positive experience, it could elevate the hotel's reputation even further." James nodded, though he felt a twinge of apprehension. "And if it doesn't go well, it could set us back." The arrival. Preston Hall arrived in a fleet of black luxury cars. His personal assistant, a stern woman named Elise, stepped out first, ensuring everything was in order before Preston emerged. The staff was on high alert, eager to impress. James observed from a distance as John, now the fully fledged front desk manager, greeted Preston with professionalism. "Welcome to the Orion Grand Hotel, Mr. Hall. We're honored to have you with us." Preston barely acknowledged John's words, rushing past him with a curt nod. His assistants trailed behind, carrying several leather suitcases. Maria, now a confident member of the concierge team, stepped forward to assist, but was met with a dismissive wave of Preston's hand. "I don't need help," Preston said, his tone clipped. "Just get me to my suite." John exchanged a nervous glance with Maria, but quickly recovered. "Right this way, Mr. Hall." James watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening. He could sense that Preston would be a challenge, a demanding guest. Over the next few days, Preston's presence was felt throughout the hotel. He demanded breakfast be delivered to his suite at precisely 7:15 a.m., and when it arrived at 7:16 one morning, he berated the server for being unprofessional. He insisted on daily spa treatments but complained that the water temperature in the jacuzzi wasn't optimal. Staff members began to dread his calls, which were frequent and often unreasonable. Maria approached James in the lobby one afternoon. "Mr. Johnson, we're trying our best, but nothing seems to satisfy him." James frowned. "Has he said what he's unhappy with, specifically?" "No," Maria admitted, "but he's intimidating. People are afraid to ask." James considered this. "I'll speak with him." The confrontation. That evening, James knocked on the door of Preston's suite. Illis answered, her sharp gaze sizing him up. "Mr. Hall is busy," she said curtly. "I won't take much of his time." James replied, his tone polite but firm. Illis hesitated before stepping aside to let him in. Preston was seated at the dining table, reviewing papers. He barely looked up as James approached. "Mr. Hall," James began, "I'm James Johnson, the owner of this hotel. I wanted to check in personally to ensure your stay is meeting your expectations." Preston glanced at him, his expression indifferent. "It's fine." James raised an eyebrow. "Fine. I've received multiple reports that you're dissatisfied with several aspects of your stay." Preston set down his papers, his gaze cold. "If you already know I'm dissatisfied, why are you here asking me about it? Fix the problems, and stop wasting my time." James's calm demeanor didn't falter. "That's exactly what I intend to do. But to fix the problems, I need to understand what they are." Preston leaned back in his chair, studying James. "You want honesty. Fine. This place is trying too hard to be something it's not. Luxury is about exclusivity, about catering to people like me, not about bending over backward to make every guest feel included. That's not how you run a five-star establishment." James's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I understand your perspective, Mr. Hall, but that's not the kind of hotel we're building here. The Orion Grand is about exceptional service for everyone, not just a select few." Preston smirked. "Well, good luck with that. But if you want to keep people like me coming back, you'll need to rethink your priorities." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "With all due respect, Mr. Hall, our priorities are clear: respect, dignity, and excellence for every guest and employee. If that doesn't align with your expectations, perhaps this isn't the right hotel for you." Preston's smirk faded, replaced by a look of mild surprise. He wasn't used to being challenged. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish." James stood tall. "I prefer to think of it as committed." Standing firm. The tension between Preston and the staff didn't ease, but James's message resonated with his team. Seeing their leader stand up to such an influential guest boosted their confidence. John, Maria, and others began to approach Preston's demands with professionalism, but without fear, setting boundaries where necessary. One evening, Maria delivered Preston's dinner to his suite. When he complained that the steak was slightly overcooked, she responded calmly, "I'll have the kitchen prepare a new one right away, sir. In the meantime, perhaps you'd enjoy the wine we've paired with your meal." Preston blinked, surprised by her composure. "Fine," he muttered, waving her off. A turning point. As the days passed, Preston's demeanor began to shift subtly. He still made demands, but they became less unreasonable. He seemed to observe the staff with a new level of respect, though he never voiced it aloud. On the final day of his stay, Preston requested a meeting with James. They met in the lounge, where Preston surprised James by extending a hand. "I'll admit," Preston said, "I didn't expect much from this place when I arrived. But you've proven me wrong." James shook his hand, his expression neutral. "I'm glad to hear that." Preston smirked faintly. "Don't get me wrong. I still think you're running a risky operation. But you've got guts, and I respect that." As Preston left, James couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Not because he had won over Preston, but because he had stood firm in his principles. The ripple effect. Word of Preston's experience spread quickly. Guests who had once doubted the hotel's new direction began to take notice. Reviews highlighted the professionalism and warmth of the staff, and the hotel's reputation grew stronger by the day. One evening, as James walked through the bustling lobby, he noticed Maria chatting with a guest who was praising her attentiveness. John was assisting a family at the front desk, his confidence shining. Carla was organizing her housekeeping team with a smile. Vivian joined James, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. James shook his head. "We did it. All of us." The Orion Grand Hotel was no longer just a place of luxury. It was a symbol of integrity, resilience, and the belief that success didn't require compromise on values. For James Johnson, it was proof that true leadership meant staying the course, even when it wasn't easy. The legacy of the Orion Grand. The Orion Grand Hotel, under James Johnson's leadership, had become more than just a building with luxury amenities. It had become a story, a place that embodied respect, fairness, and inclusivity, and a beacon of what hospitality could look like when built on principles rather than appearances. Months after Preston Hall's departure, the hotel buzzed with an energy that was both invigorating and harmonious. Staff moved confidently through their roles, guests felt truly seen and cared for, and James began to feel that the vision he had worked tirelessly to build was finally taking root. But as with any great success, challenges continued to arise, testing the strength of the foundation he had built. A proposal with strings attached. One brisk autumn morning, James received a call from the parent company that owned the Orion Grand's brand. They had taken notice of the hotel's turnaround and were impressed by its recent success. So impressed, in fact, that they wanted to meet with James to discuss expanding his model to other properties within their portfolio. Vivian walked into his office as James ended the call. "You look conflicted," she said, sitting on the edge of his desk. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "That was the corporate office. They want to discuss rolling out what we've done here to other hotels." Vivian's eyes widened. "That's incredible, isn't it?" "It could be," James admitted, "but they're not known for valuing the same principles we've worked so hard to uphold. If they're only interested in profits, it could compromise everything we've built." Vivian nodded thoughtfully. "So what's the plan?" "Their team is visiting next week. I'll hear them out," James said, a note of resolve in his voice. "But I'm not going to agree to anything that undermines what we've created." The corporate visit. The corporate representatives arrived on a Monday morning, a group of sharp-dressed executives who carried themselves with the confidence of people used to being in control. The leader of the delegation, a man named Richard Caldwell, was direct and to the point. "We've been watching the Orion Grand closely," Caldwell said as they sat in the hotel's conference room. "What you've accomplished here is nothing short of remarkable. Occupancy rates are up, guest satisfaction scores are higher than ever, and your staff turnover is almost non-existent." "Thank you," James said simply, his tone guarded. "It's been a team effort." Caldwell nodded. "That's why we want to bring your approach to other properties in our portfolio. We think your leadership could transform underperforming locations." James' expression didn't change. "And what exactly does that transformation look like?" Caldwell leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "We're looking for results, Mr. Johnson. We're confident that your principles, adjusted slightly to fit the broader corporate strategy, can deliver those results." "Adjusted," James repeated, his voice calm but pointed. "What kind of adjustments are we talking about?" Caldwell hesitated. "Look, we understand your focus on inclusivity and fairness, and it's admirable. But we also need to consider the expectations of high-profile clients. If some policies need to be tweaked to ensure their satisfaction, we expect flexibility." Vivian, who had joined the meeting, spoke up. "So, you're asking him to compromise the very values that made this a success?" Caldwell's smile was thin. "We're asking him to find a balance. Surely you understand that business sometimes requires difficult decisions." James folded his hands on the table, his expression resolute. "I've made plenty of difficult decisions, but compromising the integrity of this model isn't one of them. Caldwell's smile faltered. Are you saying you're unwilling to collaborate? I'm saying, James replied, that any collaboration would need to prioritize respect for guests and employees alike. If that's not something you're willing to support, then we're done here. The room went silent. Caldwell exchanged glances with his team, then stood. Think it over, Mr. Johnson. We'll be in touch. The community steps in. The encounter with the corporate team left James and Vivian uneasy, but they didn't have long to dwell on it. Within days, news of the potential corporate expansion leaked to the staff. While some employees were excited by the idea of the Orion Grand's principles being shared more widely, others worried that corporate oversight would undo everything they had worked so hard to build. Carla, the head of housekeeping, approached James after a shift. Mr. Johnson, the team's talking about this expansion. They're worried that it'll mean going back to how things used to be. James sighed. I won't let that happen, Carla. I've made that clear to the corporate office. But do they care what you think? She asked bluntly. James paused, then smiled faintly. We'll see. Unbeknownst to James, John and Maria decided to take matters into their own hands. They rallied the staff to draft a letter to the corporate office, signed by nearly every employee. The letter praised James's leadership and the culture he had created, emphasizing how it had improved not just their jobs, but their lives. They sent it without telling him, determined to make their voices heard. A surprising ally. 2 weeks later, James received an unexpected visitor, Preston Hall. The billionaire strode into James's office unannounced, looking as self-assured as ever. Mr. Hall, James said, rising from his desk. This is a surprise. Preston smirked. I heard about your little corporate dilemma. Thought I'd drop by. James raised an eyebrow. How did you hear about it? I have my sources, Preston replied, taking the seat. Word is, they're pressuring you to dilute your vision. Am I right? James frowned. Something like that. Preston leaned forward, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Don't let them. What you've built here is rare. You've got a culture that actually works, and that's worth protecting. James studied him, surprised by the support. Why do you care? Preston shrugged. Because I've seen what happens when people compromise for the sake of profits. It might work short-term, but long-term. It kills innovation, morale, and trust. And I don't like backing a losing horse. James smirked. So, this is an investment. Preston chuckled. Consider it. An endorsement. If you need leverage, let me know. People listen to me. A new path forward. With Preston's unexpected backing and the staff's heartfelt letter in hand, James returned to the negotiating table with the corporate office. This time, he came prepared. Here's the deal, James said, laying the letter on the table during a video conference with Caldwell and his team. This isn't just about me. This is about the people who make this hotel what it is. They've spoken, and I'm here to make sure their voices are heard. Caldwell frowned. And what exactly are you proposing? A partnership, James replied. If you want to replicate the Orion Grand success, it has to be done my way. That means no compromises on the principles that got us here. Caldwell hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. All right, Mr. Johnson. We'll give you the autonomy you're asking for, but the results need to speak for themselves. They will, James said confidently. A legacy to remember. The Orion Grand became the blueprint for a new era in hospitality, with James overseeing the transformation of other properties. But the original hotel remained his heart and soul. It stood as a testament to what could be achieved when values were prioritized over profit and people were treated with respect. One evening, as James and Vivian stood in the bustling lobby, Emily, now a teenager, joined them. You've made this place famous, Dad, she said with a proud smile. James smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It's not about fame, sweetheart. It's about leaving something better than we found it. And as the lights of the Orion Grand sparkled against the night sky, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. The Orion Grand wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a legacy. The ripple effect. Months turned into years, and the transformation of the Orion Grand Hotel became more than a story of one man's vision. It became a movement. What started as a single hotel blossomed into a series of properties adopting James Johnson's principles of integrity, inclusivity, and excellence. But as the ripple effect spread, new challenges emerged, testing James's resolve and shaping the legacy of the Orion Grand in ways he could never have anticipated. A letter from the past. One quiet morning, James sat in his office, gazing out at the city skyline. The years had brought both triumphs and trials, and the hotel was thriving. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was John, now the official general manager of the Orion Grand, holding a large envelope. "This came for you," John said, placing the envelope on James's desk. James frowned as he picked it up. It was addressed to him personally, the handwriting unfamiliar. Opening it, he found a handwritten letter and a faded photograph of the hotel from decades ago. The letter began, "Dear Mr. Johnson, I've followed the story of the Orion Grand with great interest. Though I've never stayed at your hotel, it holds a special place in my heart. You see, many years ago, I worked here as a housekeeper when it first opened. Back then, the culture was very different, cold, hierarchical, and exclusive. Employees like me were invisible, treated as expendable and unworthy of respect. When I read about how you stood up for your staff and built a culture of respect, I was moved to tears. It's what I dreamed of for this place, but never thought possible. Thank you for making that dream a reality, not just for yourself, but for everyone who steps through your doors. Warm regards, Margaret Ellis." James stared at the letter for a long moment, his chest tightening. He handed it to Vivian, who had entered the office behind John. "This," he said softly, "is why we do what we do." Vivian smiled as she read the letter. Margaret's story isn't unique. There are so many people who've faced what she faced, but you gave them something they never had, a voice. James nodded. "We need to find her." Finding Margaret. It took weeks of research and outreach, but eventually, James's team tracked Margaret Ellis to a small town a few hours away. She was in her late 70s, retired, and living a quiet life with her family. James, Vivian, and John made the trip personally to visit her. When they arrived at her modest home, Margaret greeted them with a mix of surprise and joy. "I didn't expect you to come all this way," she said, her hands trembling as she held the door open. James smiled warmly. "Your letter meant the world to us. The least we could do is thank you in person." Margaret invited them in, and over cups of tea, she shared stories of her time at the Orion Grand. She described the challenges she had faced as a young, single mother trying to make ends meet, and the lack of dignity she was shown by both management and guests. "I stayed because I didn't have a choice," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But I always dreamed of a day when people like me wouldn't have to choose between a job and their dignity." James reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Your story is the foundation of everything we're building, and it's far from over." The Margaret Ellis Scholarship. Inspired by Margaret's story, James announced the creation of the Margaret Ellis Scholarship, a program designed to provide education and career development opportunities for hospitality workers. The program would fund tuition for employees who wanted to further their education and offer professional training to help them advance within the industry. The announcement was met with overwhelming support. Employees at the Orion Grand and its sister properties celebrated the initiative, and applications poured in from across the country. Maria, now a senior concierge, was one of the first recipients. "This scholarship means everything to me," she said at the launch event. "It's not just about what it'll do for my career. It's about knowing that someone believes in me." Margaret was invited to the event as the guest of honor. She stood on stage alongside James, tears streaming down her face as she received a standing ovation. "This," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "is more than I ever could have imagined. Thank you for giving people like me a chance to dream." Facing a new threat. As the Orion Grand's reputation grew, so did its influence. But with success came envy, and competitors began to take notice. One rival hotel chain, known for its cutthroat tactics, launched a smear campaign against the Orion Grand, accusing it of sacrificing luxury for inclusivity. The campaign gained traction, with critics questioning whether the hotel could truly maintain its five-star status while focusing so heavily on employee welfare and guest inclusivity. James held an emergency meeting with his leadership team. "This is an attack on everything we stand for," he said, "but we're not going to stoop to their level." Vivian agreed. "We'll counter their narrative, but we'll do it by showing the world exactly who we are." A bold response. James and his team launched a campaign of their own, titled "The Heart of Hospitality." It featured real stories from employees, guests, and community members whose lives had been impacted by the Orion Grand. The campaign highlighted the hotel's commitment to excellence without compromising its values. One particularly moving ad featured Carla, the head of housekeeping, who shared how the culture shift had transformed her work environment. Another showcased John, who spoke about how James's mentorship had given him the confidence to lead. The campaign went viral, sparking a national conversation about what true luxury meant. Critics were silenced as the Orion Grand's occupancy rates soared to record highs, and its staff received praise for their professionalism and warmth. An unforgettable night. Months later, the Orion Grand hosted its most prestigious event yet, a gala celebrating its 10th anniversary under James's leadership. Guests from around the world gathered in the hotel's grand ballroom, which was decorated with an elegant yet welcoming theme that reflected the hotel's unique identity. James stood at the podium, looking out at the room filled with employees, guests, and supporters. Emily, now a young woman, stood proudly beside him. "When we started this journey," James began, "we weren't just building a hotel. We were building a community. Tonight, we celebrate not just our success, but the people who made it possible." He paused, his voice growing emotional. "The Orion Grand isn't just a place to stay, it's a place to belong. And that's a legacy we can all be proud of." As the room erupted in applause, James looked out at the faces of those who had walked this journey with him. From Margaret Ellis to John and Maria, to every guest and employee who had contributed to the story of the Orion Grand, he saw a reflection of the values that had guided him from the beginning. And in that moment, James knew that the legacy of the Orion Grand was secure, not in its marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but in the lives it had touched and the hearts it had changed. A global vision. The Orion Grand's reputation as a beacon of inclusive luxury had solidified, not just locally but internationally. What began as one hotel's transformation had grown into a movement reshaping the hospitality industry. Yet James Johnson was restless. With the hotel's legacy secure, he began to envision something even greater, extending the values of the Orion Grand beyond the boundaries of traditional luxury to places and people who had never experienced it. Vivian noticed his introspection one evening as they walked through the bustling lobby, now brimming with life and laughter. "You've got that look," she said with a teasing smile. "What look?" James asked. "The one that means you're about to shake things up," she replied. "What's on your mind?" James stopped, gazing at the staff interacting with guests, the warmth and professionalism palpable. "I'm thinking about how we can take this further," he said. "Not just more hotels, but a completely new way of thinking about hospitality. What if the Orion Grand became more than a destination? What if it became a catalyst for change?" Vivian tilted her head. "Change where?" James's eyes sparkled with determination. "Everywhere." The genesis of the Orion Outreach Initiative. The following week, James called a meeting with his leadership team, including John, Maria, Carla, and other senior staff members. They gathered in the hotel's sunlit conference room, curious about the purpose of the meeting. I've been thinking about what's next for us, James began, standing at the head of the table. We've proven that luxury and inclusivity can coexist. But what if we could do more? What if we could bring the values of the Orion Grand to communities that have never experienced hospitality like this? John frowned slightly. Do you mean opening more hotels? Not exactly, James replied. I'm talking about creating a new branch of the Orion brand, something focused on outreach. We'd partner with underprivileged communities to build training centers, offer scholarships, and create opportunities for people to enter the hospitality industry. Maria's eyes lit up. You mean giving people like us, who started from the ground up, a chance to succeed? Exactly, James said, and not just succeed in their careers, but bring these values back to their own communities. The room buzzed with excitement as the team discussed the possibilities. They decided to call the new initiative Orion Outreach, with a mission to extend the principles of respect, dignity, and excellence to underserved areas around the world. The first project, Orion Haven. The first Orion Outreach project was set in a small coastal village in Southeast Asia. The village had suffered years of economic hardship, its once thriving tourism industry decimated by natural disasters and neglect. James and his team saw an opportunity to revitalize the community through sustainable hospitality. They named the project Orion Haven, a boutique eco-lodge that would serve as both a training center and a destination for socially conscious travelers. The lodge would be built using local materials, powered by renewable energy, and staffed entirely by local residents who would be trained in hospitality by Orion's team. James and Vivian traveled to the village to meet with community leaders, who greeted them with a mix of hope and skepticism. Why here? Asked Mr. Ananda, an elder of the village. Many promises have been made to us, but few have been kept. James met his gaze steadily. Because this isn't about charity, it's about partnership. We're not here to impose our vision. We're here to build something together, something that benefits everyone. Over the next several weeks, James and his team worked side by side with the villagers to plan the project. Vivian helped design the lodge, incorporating local traditions and artistry into its architecture. Maria trained a group of young villagers in customer service, while Carla taught others about housekeeping and maintenance. For the villagers, the transformation was more than just economic, it was personal. Many had never imagined themselves as part of something so grand. As one young trainee, Shuri, put it, I used to think I was invisible. Now I feel seen. Challenges and resilience. As construction on Orion Haven progressed, challenges arose. A sudden monsoon delayed work for weeks, leaving parts of the site flooded. Funding became an issue as costs exceeded initial estimates. Some villagers, still wary of outsiders, resisted involvement. James worked tirelessly to address each obstacle. He secured additional funding through private investors who believed in the project's mission. He met with resistant villagers individually, listening to their concerns and incorporating their input into the plans. When tensions ran high, James reminded his team of the bigger picture. This isn't just about building a lodge, he said during one particularly challenging day. It's about proving that dignity and opportunity can thrive anywhere, even in the hardest places. A grand opening. 2 years after its inception, Orion Haven opened its doors to the world. The lodge, perched on a hill overlooking the ocean, was a stunning blend of modern sustainability and traditional design. Its staff, once skeptical villagers, now welcomed guests with pride and confidence. James and Vivian attended the opening ceremony, standing alongside the villagers who had become partners in the project. Suri, now the lodge's guest services manager, gave a heartfelt speech. When this began, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, we thought it was just a dream. But today, it's our reality. And it's a reality built on respect, hard work, and hope. The crowd erupted in applause, and James felt a lump rise in his throat. This was what the Orion Grand had always been about, not just luxury, but transformation. Global recognition. The success of Orion Haven garnered international attention. Media outlets praised it as a model for sustainable and inclusive development, and other communities began reaching out, asking to partner with Orion Outreach. James found himself invited to conferences and panels, sharing his vision with industry leaders. Yet he remained grounded, always emphasizing the people behind the success. "This isn't about me," he said during a keynote speech. "It's about the people we serve, the staff, the guests, the communities. They're the heart of this work." The next chapter. Back at the Orion Grand, James and Vivian reflected on how far they had come. The hotel was thriving, the staff was happier than ever, and Orion Outreach was poised to expand to new regions. One evening, as they stood on the hotel's rooftop terrace overlooking the city lights, Emily joined them, now a young woman studying business and sustainability. "Dad," she said, "what you've built is incredible. But what's next?" James smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "What's next is finding more places to make a difference. And someday, you'll help lead the way." As the family stood together, the lights of the Orion Grand shining behind them, James felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The legacy of the hotel had grown beyond its walls, touching lives in ways he had only dreamed of. And as he looked out at the horizon, he knew the journey was far from over. It was only just beginning.